The Nera Imperium's shadow stretched across the stars like a deadly plague. For 300 years, they had conquered and subjugated without mercy. Their ships, half machine and half living tissue, moved between solar systems with terrifying efficiency. The enforcers who carried out the Imperium's will weren't quite robots, and weren't quite alive. Obsidian black forms with multiple limbs that moved too quickly and too precisely. Administrator Park stood at the viewport of his small office on New Cascade, the mining colony he'd been assigned to manage 5 years ago. Outside, the perpetual dust storms swirled around the habitat domes and industrial facilities. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked again at the production numbers on his screen. They were bad. Worse than yesterday. Worse than last week. "Computer, run the projections again," he said softly. Confirming. Current output trends indicate quota shortfall of 22.4% by cycle end, the system replied. Park's stomach tightened. Last month, the shortfall had been 18%, and the Nara overseer had executed 3 mid-level managers as a motivational adjustment. What would they do now? Down in the primary shaft, miners worked relentlessly. The heavy extraction rigs drilled deep into New Cascade's crust, pulling up the rare minerals the Nara needed for their technology. The air was thick with dust despite the filtration systems. Men and women in worn protective gear moved with the slow, deliberate pace of those who know no amount of hurry will ever be enough. Jin, the crew chief of Shaft 7, checked the readouts on his tablet. His section was running at 85% of quota. Better than most, but not enough. Never enough. "Push harder," shouted the human overseer from his elevated platform. "Shift ends when quota is met." The workers didn't even bother to look up. They had been on shift for 14 hours already. In orbit above New Cascade, the Nara command vessel maintained its silent vigil. Unlike human ships, it had no visible engines, no gun emplacements, no antennas. Just a smooth, curved hull that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Inside, Overseer Thanix 9 reviewed the colony's performance metrics. The Overseer's body was a perfect fusion of biological and mechanical elements, designed for optimal control and minimal empathy. Its multiple eyes could process information across 12 different light spectrums. Its neural processors could calculate the most efficient method of maintaining control down to the last drop of blood required. Production efficiency continues to decline, it observed to its subordinates. Humans respond inadequately to standard motivation protocols. Previous adjustments showed temporary improvement, noted Second Enforcer. Perhaps a larger demonstration is required. Probability calculations support this approach. Thanix 9's voice was cold and precise. Prepare for a population reduction of 30%. Select from lowest productivity sectors. In the colony's administrative center, Park received the summons to report to the Nara liaison office. His steps were heavy as he walked down the sterile corridor. Other human administrators avoided his eyes as he passed. Everyone knew what these summons usually meant. The liaison office was kept at a temperature several degrees colder than humans found comfortable, just one of many small ways the Nara reminded humans of their subordinate status. The human liaison, Kim, sat rigidly at her desk. Her face was a careful mask, but Park could see the fear in her eyes. "Administrator Park," she said formally. "Overseer Thanix 9 has reviewed the production reports. We're implementing new measures," Park said quickly. "The equipment failures in Sector 4 have been addressed. We can increase output by—" "The decision has been made," Kim interrupted, her voice flat. "A demographic adjustment of 30% has been scheduled. The mining sectors with the lowest productivity will be targeted." Park felt his blood turn to ice. 30%. That's— He couldn't finish. That was thousands of people. "The adjustment will commence in 12 hours, Kim continued, not meeting his eyes. "You are to prepare the necessary population redistribution plans for after the procedure." "There must be another way," Park pleaded. "Give us another chance. We can meet the quotas if—" "This meeting is concluded," Kim said, finally looking at him with empty eyes. You have your instructions." Back in his office, Park stared at the colony plans spread across his desk. He had to warn people. He had to do something. But the Nera monitored all communications. Anyone attempting to interfere with a demographic adjustment would be the first eliminated. Outside his window, New Cascade continued its daily routine, unaware of what was coming. Children played in the small recreational areas between shifts. Miners trudged home, their faces gray with exhaustion and dust. Families gathered for evening meals in crowded habitation units. Park thought of his own family, relatively safe in the administrative sector. They would survive this culling. But how many more would follow? How long before no one was left? The Nara had conquered hundreds of worlds using the same approach. Break the spirit, eliminate the troublesome, work the rest until they collapsed, then move on when the resources were depleted. Humanity had fought when they first came, fought hard, and fought well. But the Nera didn't fight like humans. They didn't seek glory in battle or territory for its own sake. They simply calculated the most efficient path to victory and followed it without hesitation or mercy. As night fell on New Cascade, Park made his decision. He couldn't save everyone, but he could try to warn Shaft 7, the most vulnerable target given their production numbers. His friend Jin deserved at least that much. He would use the old emergency system, the one installed before the Nera came. It might work for a few minutes before they detected it. It wasn't much. It probably wouldn't even help. But it was something. A small defiance in the face of the implacable darkness that had swallowed the stars. As he encoded the warning message, Park thought about all the stories humans used to tell about their future in space. None of them had prepared them for becoming nothing more than resources to be managed and discarded by the likes of the Nera Imperium. Shumi Kim pressed her small hands against the observation window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the stars. She was 8 years old with bright eyes that missed nothing and a quick mind that questioned everything. The observation deck of Residential Block C was her favorite place. Here she could see beyond the drab walls and recycled air of the mining colony. Most children in New Cascade never looked up. They learned early to keep their heads down, to be quiet, to not attract attention. But Shumi was different. She believed the stars held secrets, maybe even freedom. One day, she whispered to herself, "I'll fly away on a big ship." The childminders at the communal care center were supposed to be watching her, but they were busy with the younger children. Shumi had slipped away during mealtime. She knew all the shortcuts through the residential block, which maintenance panels could be removed, which air ducts were wide enough for a small girl to crawl through. She knew she should go back soon. Missing children were reported to the Nara, and no one wanted to attract their attention. But today was special. A supply ship was due from Earth, maybe carrying messages from her father, who worked on another colony. Her mother, son, worked double shifts at the refinery. To keep us safe, she always said when Shumi complained about being left with the childminders again. Shumi didn't fully understand what her mother meant, but she saw the fear in son's eyes whenever the Nara enforcers patrolled their sector. As she waited for the supply ship, something else appeared in the sky. 3 ships, but not the bulky cargo vessels she was used to seeing. These were sleek and dark, with hulls that seemed to pulse with purple-blue energy patterns. Shuma had seen Nara ships before, but usually they stayed in high orbit. These were coming down, getting closer to the colony. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. She had never seen Nara ships fly so low. The ships didn't head toward the administrative docks where official visitors arrived. Instead, they moved toward the industrial sector, toward the refinery where her mother worked. "Mom," she whispered, her breath catching. When the first explosion lit up the distant dome of the refinery sector, Shumi didn't think. She ran. Not back to the safety of the childminders, but toward the danger, toward her mother. The hallways of Residential Block C were suddenly filled with adults rushing in all directions. The colony alarm began to wail. Shumi ducked behind a water recycling unit as 2 security officers ran past. "They're hitting the refinery and shafts 6 through 9. One shouted. "It's a purge." Sumi didn't understand what a purge was, but she knew it was bad. She slipped into a maintenance tunnel that connected the residential blocks to the work sectors. Adults used the main corridors and transport tubes, but Shuma had mapped every secret path in the colony during her explorations. The service corridor was dark except for emergency lights that cast long shadows. Distant booms shook dust from the ceiling. Shuma kept moving forward, her small shoes making no sound on the metal flooring. She emerged from the tunnel into chaos. The connecting hub between residential and industrial sectors was filled with people trying to flee the refinery area. Guards were struggling to maintain order. "Return to your quarters," they shouted. "Lockdown protocols are in effect. Anyone outside designated areas will be subject to enforcement." Shumi stayed close to the walls, using her size to slip between adults. No one noticed one small girl moving against the tide of fleeing workers. The doors to the refinery sector were sealed, but Shuma knew another way. Behind the public washrooms was a maintenance hatch that led to the climate control system for the refinery. Workers sometimes used it for unauthorized breaks. The smell of smoke grew stronger as she crawled through the narrow passage. Her eyes stung and her throat felt tight, but she kept going. Mom worked on level 3, East Quadrant. She had shown Sumi once during a colony open day. When Shumi finally emerged from the duct, the refinery was almost unrecognizable. Emergency lights flashed, casting red pulses over scenes of destruction. The normal hum of machinery was replaced by the crackle of electrical fires and distant screams. "Mom," she called, but her voice was lost in the noise. She ran through the smoke-filled corridors, dodging fallen equipment. She had almost reached her mother's workstation when she saw them. The Nara enforcers. They moved with inhuman grace, their many-limbed bodies flowing like liquid shadow. In their hands were weapons that pulsed with the same energy she had seen on their ships. Workers were lined up against a wall. Sumi recognized her mother's friend Jin among them. The enforcers moved methodically down the line, firing their weapons. People simply collapsed, their bodies sometimes dissolving into ash. Sumi crouched behind a fallen processing unit, her hand pressed against her mouth to keep from screaming. This couldn't be happening. The Nara were strict and scary, but they had never done this before. Through the smoke, she spotted her mother. Sun was helping an injured coworker move toward an emergency exit on the far side of the chamber. They were moving away from the enforcers, staying low. Shumi wanted to call out, but knew it would alert the Nara. Instead, she began to move toward her mother, keeping to the shadows as she had during countless games of hide-and-seek in the residential block. She was halfway there when the section door slammed shut, cutting off the escape route her mother had been heading for. Sun turned, desperation on her face as she sought another way out. That's when she saw Shuma. Their eyes met across the smoke-filled space. Sun's face transformed from fear to terror. She shook her head frantically, mouthing, "Go back." But it was too late. One of the enforcers had noticed the movement. It turned, multiple eyes scanning until they fixed on Suma's small form, its weapon raised. Sumi didn't understand what was happening. She just knew she needed to reach her mother. She broke from her hiding place and ran. "Suma, no!" Sun screamed, lunging forward. The enforcer didn't hesitate. It fired once, then twice. The colony's security systems recorded everything. The methodical execution of workers. The appearance of a small girl running through smoke and chaos. The mother's desperate lunge. The enforcer's unhesitating response. The final moments as Sun reached her daughter, both of them falling as the energy weapon did its work. The Nara had calculated precisely how many humans to eliminate to ensure future compliance. Their algorithms had determined the most efficient targets, the optimal methods, the necessary percentage of population reduction. What they had not calculated was the presence of a child who loved her mother more than she feared them. They had not predicted that a small girl named Sumi Kim would run toward danger instead of away from it. And they had not foreseen how her death would change everything. The recording found its way out of New Cascade 3 days after the massacre. A technician named June, who maintained the colony's security systems, had backed up the footage before the Nera could purge it completely. He knew he would die for this act of defiance. He did it anyway. June used an old emergency channel to transmit the data to a passing trade vessel. From there, it jumped from ship to ship, station to station. The Nera information control systems caught and blocked it thousands of times. But humans kept finding new ways to share it, new channels to exploit, new codes to hide the data. 2 weeks after the massacre, the recording reached Earth. Lu, a mid-level data analyst at Central Distribution in Shanghai, was the first to see it. She watched in horror as the events unfolded on her screen. The systematic killing of workers, the smoke-filled corridors, and then the small figure of Shumi running toward her mother. Lu had a daughter the same age. She left her workstation without a word, went to the bathroom, and vomited. Then she copied the recording and sent it to everyone she knew. By the next morning, half of Earth had seen Sumi Kim die. People wept in the streets. Mothers held their children tighter. Fathers stared into space with clenched fists. But there were no protests, no riots, no visible resistance. The Nera enforcers stationed on Earth noted only that productivity dropped by 6% that day, an acceptable fluctuation after a necessary demonstration of authority. The Nera did not understand what was happening beneath the surface. In the mining colonies of Mars, Supervisor Ta watched the recording in his small quarters. The next day, his team's equipment suffered a mysterious malfunction. Production halted for 13 hours. When questioned by Nera officials, Ta shrugged. "Things break," he said flatly. On the orbital shipyards of Europa, Engineer Min viewed the footage on a smuggled datapad. Her hand trembled as she watched Suma's last moments. The following week, she approved a batch of navigation components with microscopic flaws. 12 Nera vessels would later experience critical system failures. In the agricultural domes of Ganymede, farm manager Hannah saw the recording during her rest period. She said nothing to anyone. 3 days later, she adjusted the nutrient mix in the hydroponic system by a fraction of a percent, just enough to reduce crop yields by 20% without causing visible disease. None of these people communicated with each other. There was no conspiracy, no organized resistance, no detectable pattern for the Nera to track and eliminate. Just millions of individual humans making private decisions. The Nera noticed the effects soon enough. Supply deliveries arrived incomplete. Production quotas went unmet across human territories. Equipment failed at twice the normal rate. Administrative systems developed seemingly random errors that delayed operations. Productivity has decreased by 22% across all human sectors, reported Overseer Call 12 to the Central Command. Preliminary analysis suggests a coordinated work slowdown. The response was swift and predictable. The Nera increased enforcement presence in all human territories. New quotas were established, with severe penalties for failure. Example executions were carried out in major population centers. On the lunar colony, they executed 50 workers from a manufacturing plant that had fallen behind schedule. Production dropped by another 15% the next day. In the orbital habitats of Earth, they purged an entire residential sector after detecting unauthorized data transmissions. 3 critical life support systems mysteriously failed in adjacent sectors soon after. Human response patterns have deviated from all established models, admitted Overseer Call 12 6 weeks after the New Cascade massacre. Increased enforcement is proving counterproductive. The Nera had handled rebellions before. They understood organized resistance. It could be infiltrated, undermined, its leaders identified and eliminated. But this was something different. There were no leaders to remove, no cells to break, no communications to intercept. Just a silent, implacable withdrawal of the cooperation they had taken for granted. In her small apartment in Shanghai, Lu continued her work at Central Distribution. She approved shipments, processed requests, and maintained the appearance of a model employee. But every day, she introduced small delays into the system, routing shipments through unnecessary checkpoints, flagging routine requests for additional review, approving slightly incorrect inventory counts. None of her actions were dramatic enough to trigger security algorithms. Just sand in the gears, slowing everything down. Lou never spoke of what she was doing, even to her husband. She simply thought of Sumi Kim each morning and did what needed to be done. On Mars, Tai and his mining crew continued to meet their reduced quotas, just barely. Equipment continued to break down with unusual frequency. Repair parts were misplaced. Drill bits wore out faster than expected. The Nera replaced the human supervisors 3 times, but nothing improved. Each night, Ta dreamed of Shumi running through smoke to reach her mother. Each morning, he found new ways to ensure the Nera received less than they demanded. The Nera responded with increasingly desperate measures. They implemented redundant oversight systems. They increased random monitoring of human workers. They conducted mass replacements of personnel in critical positions. Nothing worked. For every troublemaker they identified and eliminated, the problem seemed to spread further. Their predictive models, refined over centuries of galactic control, failed completely when applied to current human behavior. "They're communicating somehow," insisted Enforcer Prime Ren 8 during an emergency conclave. "There must be hidden networks, coded messages. Find them." But there were no messages to find, no networks to disrupt, just the shared memory of a small girl running toward her mother, and the silent, collective decision that followed. 3 months after the New Cascade massacre, the first Nera supply depot was destroyed. No one claimed responsibility. No demands were issued. The automated facility simply exploded during a routine transfer operation. Investigation revealed that a maintenance drone had been improperly programmed, causing it to disable safety protocols. 2 weeks later, a Nara communication hub in the asteroid belt suffered catastrophic failure when a human technician installed an incompatible power regulator. The technician was executed immediately. 3 more hubs failed the following month. The Nara had built their empire on the predictable responses of conquered species. Fear led to compliance. Punishment reinforced authority. It had worked perfectly for centuries. Until now. Human productivity continues to decline despite increased enforcement, reported Overseer Call 12 to the increasingly concerned Central Command. "We are facing a systemic failure in the human territories that threatens to spread to other sectors." What the Nara couldn't grasp was that something fundamental had changed. Humans had endured conquest, subjugation, and exploitation. They had bent to the inevitable, accepting their place in the Nara order. But the death of Sumi Kim had shattered that acceptance. It wasn't just that a child had been killed. It was that she had been killed while running toward her mother, fueled by love rather than fear. That simple act of human connection, snuffed out so casually, had awakened something the Nara had never encountered before. Not rebellion, not resistance, something deeper and more dangerous. The absolute certainty that some things were worse than death. Admiral Hand stood on the bridge of the Defiance, a stolen Nara scout vessel that had been stripped, rebuilt, and hidden in the shadow of a rogue planet. For 5 years since the fall of Earth's defense forces, she had kept a small fleet alive, gathering survivors and building a network of resistance cells. Many had called her efforts hopeless. The Nara controlled thousands of worlds. They had technologies humans barely understood. Their warships could reduce planets to ash. What could a few hundred broken ships do against such power? Han had never offered false hope. "We wait," she always told her officers. "We survive. We prepare. And when the moment comes, we strike." Now, as she watched the recording from New Cascade for the 20th time, she knew the moment had arrived. "Call the council," she ordered her executive officer, Min. "All of them. Now." 6 hours later, 12 men and women gathered in the secure command center deep within the Defiance. They represented what remained of humanity's military leadership, officers who had escaped the fall of Earth, colony commanders who had refused surrender, pilots who had flowed with whatever ships they could save. "You've all seen the footage," Han said, her voice steady. "You know what happened at New Cascade." No one spoke. The image of Sumi Kim running through smoke toward her mother had burned itself into all their minds. Intelligence reports massive disruptions across all human territories. Han continued. Not organized resistance, something different. People are simply refusing to cooperate. The Nara don't know how to handle it. Captain Lee, who commanded their small intelligence division, nodded. Their enforcement protocols are designed to identify and eliminate leadership structures. They can't comprehend decentralized resistance, which gives us an opening, Han said. For the first time, the Nara are vulnerable. Not just to us, but to their own misunderstanding of human nature. She activated the holographic display in the center of the room. A map of human space appeared, with key Nara control points highlighted. We've been building this network for 5 years, she said. Sleeper agents in administrative centers, saboteurs in maintenance crews, intelligence gatherers in communication hubs. All waiting. All ready. What are you proposing? Asked Commander Jun, an old Earth Force veteran. Not a conventional attack, Han replied. We don't have the numbers or firepower for that. Instead, we strike at their ability to control communications, supply lines, command structures. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. The Nara understand strategy, resources, and power. They don't understand rage. The plan they formed over the next 12 hours was unlike any military operation in human history. There would be no fleet engagements, no declarations of war, no pitched battles. Instead, hundreds of small actions would happen simultaneously across human space, striking at the infrastructure of Nara control. 3 days later, it began. On the Mars colony, maintenance worker Du had spent 3 years as a sleeper agent, waiting for activation. When the coded message reached him, he accessed the environmental control systems and triggered an emergency shutdown in the Nara administrative sector. In the resulting confusion, he erased the backup security protocols, leaving the facility vulnerable to the virus he had planted months earlier. At the Jupiter shipyards, Engineer Sun had methodically planted micro-explosives throughout the fuel distribution system. When her signal came, she activated them in sequence, causing a cascade of failures that disabled 37 Nara vessels without destroying them completely. The Nara would waste resources trying to repair ships that would never function properly again. In the asteroid belt mining facilities, Operations Manager Quan released the modified nanites he had been cultivating in secret. They spread through the refining equipment, altering the composition of processed metals by fractions of a percent, enough to ensure that any technology built with these materials would fail under stress. Across human space, hundreds of similar actions unfolded. None were directly lethal. None targeted Nara biology. All struck at the systems of control the Nara had built. On the Defiance, Admiral Han watched the reports flow in. Begin Phase 2, she ordered. Phase 2 was communication. Using the channels the Nara themselves had built, Han's forces broadcast a single image throughout human space. Sumi Kim's face in her final moment, reaching for her mother as the Nara enforcer fired. The effect was electric. The scattered acts of non-cooperation that had begun spontaneously after new cascades suddenly found focus and purpose. What had been individual decisions became a movement. Without leaders, without manifestos, without demands, just the shared understanding of what they were fighting against, embodied in that single, terrible image. The Nara response was swift and predictable. They increased enforcement presence. They executed suspected saboteurs. They implemented new security protocols and communication restrictions. None of it worked. Every public execution created new recruits for Han's network. Every security measure was circumvented by humans who now understood the Nara systems better than the Nara understood humans. Their psychological profiles of human behavior have become liabilities, Captain Lee reported 3 weeks into the operation. They keep expecting us to behave according to their models. When we don't, they double down on failed strategies. Admiral Han nodded. What's the status of the quantum relay network? Ready for Phase 3, Lee confirmed. Our teams are in position at 17 key nodes. Phase 3 was the most audacious part of Han's plan. The Nera controlled their vast empire through a network of quantum communication relays. These instantaneous links allowed them to coordinate actions across thousands of light years. If those relays failed, their ability to maintain control would collapse. On Han's signal, 17 teams struck simultaneously at relay stations throughout human space. They didn't destroy the relays that would have triggered immediate emergency protocols. Instead, they altered the alignment of the quantum matrices by nanometers, introducing subtle errors into every transmission. For 3 critical days, the Nera received corrupted data from every human territory. Reports of compliance when there was resistance, reports of security when there were breaches, reports of production when there was sabotage. By the time they discovered the deception, it was too late. Human space had become ungovernable. In her quarters on the Defiance, Admiral Han looked at a small photograph she kept hidden. Her family, lost when Earth fell. She had never expected to see victory. Survival had been her only goal for years. We'd given them something they've never faced before, she told the empty room. Not just resistance, not just defiance, but rage. Human rage. The Nara had ruled through fear for centuries. They had never understood what happens when humans stop being afraid, when they find something that matters more than their own survival. Across human space, the face of a small girl named Sumi Kim continued to appear on screens, walls, and windows, a reminder of what had been taken, and what would never be taken again. The chamber where the control conclave gathered had not been used in 50 years. Deep within the central hive world of the Nera Imperium, it was a perfect sphere of black material that seemed to swallow light. No sound penetrated its walls. No signals could enter or leave without authorization. Supreme Architect Vox Ultima floated in the center, its biomechanical body pulsing with energy patterns that shifted between deep purple and cold blue. Around it, 12 other high-ranking Nera connected to neural interfaces that lined the walls. Their physical forms became still as their consciousness merged into the central processing matrix. For the first time in centuries, the collective mind of the Nera leadership experienced something close to fear. The human situation has exceeded critical parameters. Vox Ultima's thoughts rippled through the shared consciousness. All models have failed. Data flowed through their merged minds. Production reports showing catastrophic declines across human territories, security breaches increasing exponentially, enforcement resources stretched beyond capacity. Most troubling were the psychological assessment updates, which showed human fear responses had dropped to nearly zero despite increased enforcement actions. They no longer respond to standard control methods, observed Primary Overseer Thalmine. Fear stimulus produces anger rather than compliance. The contagion is spreading, added War Architect Renfor. We are detecting similar behavioral shifts in 3 other subject species who have witnessed human responses. Vox Ultima absorbed their observations, processing the full scope of the crisis. For 1,000 years, the Nera Imperium had expanded across the galaxy, subjugating hundreds of species through precisely calibrated applications of force and fear. Their methodology was perfect, until now. Strategic assessment, Vox Ultima commanded. The collective consciousness shifted, running complex simulations of possible responses. The results were troubling. Complete eradication of the human species would require committing 70% of our military resources for an estimated 27 standard cycles, the analysis concluded. During this operation, 14 primary subject worlds would be left vulnerable to uprising. 3 border sectors would be exposed to external threats. Even more concerning was the success probability. Full eradication has only a 63% chance of success, given current human behavioral patterns. Partial eradication would likely accelerate resistance in surviving populations. For several moments, the collective was silent, processing the unthinkable. The Nera Imperium had never retreated, had never abandoned a conquered territory, had never admitted defeat. Alternative strategies. Vox Ultima finally prompted. Quarantine, suggested Thalmine. Withdraw all Nera presence from human space. Establish buffer zones to prevent expansion. Classify the behavioral shift as a psychological contagion and prevent its spread to other species. More simulations ran. The cost would be significant. The resources of human worlds, the loss of labor populations, the admission of failure. But the cost of continuing was higher. The human problem has become untenable. Vox Ultima finally acknowledged, the collective voice carrying a tone never before heard in Nera communication. Uncertainty. Standard protocols are ineffective. Their response defies rational models. The decision rippled through the collective consciousness. For the first time in its 1,000-year history, the Imperium would retreat. Orders flashed across the galaxy at the speed of quantum communication. Nara forces began systematic withdrawal from all human territories. Administrative centers were abandoned. Enforcement ships departed their orbital positions. Data systems were purged. On colony worlds, humans watched in disbelief as their oppressors simply left. On New Horizon, a mining colony in the outer reaches, workers emerged from underground shelters to find Nera facilities empty, doors left open, systems still running. "They're really gone," whispered Supervisor G as he walked through the abandoned enforcement center. "They just gave up." Similar scenes play out across human space. The withdrawal was not chaotic. The Nera did nothing without precision. But it was total. Within 17 days, no Nera remained in any human territory. Admiral Han stood on the bridge of the Defiance, watching the sensor displays as the last Nera battle group jumped to faster than light at the edge of the solar system. Her officers waited in tense silence, expecting a trick, a trap, a final devastating strike. But the enemy simply fled. "They never understood us," Han said quietly, breaking the silence on the bridge. "They thought fear was their greatest weapon, but they never realized what happens when humans stop being afraid and get angry instead." The liberation of human space brought challenges no one had anticipated. The Nera had controlled everything for 40 years. Food production, resource allocation, power generation, even air processing in many colonies. Their sudden absence left dangerous gaps. But humans adapted quickly. Systems were reconfigured. New leadership emerged. Resources were shared. Within months, a provisional government formed, connecting Earth with its scattered colonies. 6 months after the Nera withdrawal, Han stood in the center of New Shanghai, Earth's largest remaining city. Around her, thousands gathered for the dedication of the first memorial. As the sun set, a holographic projection appeared above the square, a small girl looking up at the stars with wonder in her eyes. Not Shuma in her final moments of terror, but Shuma as she had been before. Curious, hopeful, unafraid. "We don't build this memorial to remember our pain," Han told the crowd. "We build it to remember why we fight. Not from hatred, not from fear, but from love." Similar memorials appeared in public spaces across human worlds. Not monuments to victory or vengeance, but simple reminders of what had driven humans to achieve the impossible. Beyond the borders of human space, the galaxy took notice. The Nera Imperium still ruled vast territories, still subjugated hundreds of species. But whispers spread from world to world, system to system. Stories of the humans who had driven the Nera back. Of the child whose death had changed everything. Of what becomes possible when fear is replaced by something stronger. On the border of what the Nera now called the quarantine zone, their patrol ships maintained constant vigilance, watching for any sign that the contagion might spread. Their sensors monitored for human ships, human signals, human expansion. What they failed to monitor were the stories that traveled with traders and smugglers, the quiet conversations in the shadows of subjugated worlds, the growing understanding that spread despite all information controls. The understanding that the Nera could be beaten. In her new office in the rebuilt government complex on Earth, Admiral Han, now Defense Coordinator Han, reviewed reports from the border monitoring stations. The Nera maintained their distance, showing no signs of returning. Human space was rebuilding, growing stronger each day. On her desk sat a small holographic projector. When activated, it showed Sumi Kim looking up at the stars. Han activated it each morning, a private reminder of both what had been lost and what had been gained. They thought they understood us, she often told new recruits to the defense forces. They studied our biology, our technology, our social structures, but they never understood the most important thing about humans. She would pause then, letting them wonder. When you harm one of our children, you harm all of us, and we will never, ever forget. Across the stars, the lesson was clear. Humanity had suffered, had bent, had nearly broken. But in the end, they had driven back an enemy that had never known defeat, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the most human quality of all, the refusal to accept that some things cannot be changed. In memorial squares throughout human space, a small girl continued to look up at the stars, reminding everyone who saw her that some prices were too high to pay, some lines could not be crossed, and some enemies should have chosen their battles more wisely.